Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the last section of Chapter 3, Part 4 of Y'all Late to the Revolution. In Chapter 3, it's the revelations in the midst of the evolution of the Harlem Renaissance. Today's section is called Voices of Hues, and we're actually going to be looking at the visual art of the Harlem Renaissance. So, again, content, images, and languages in this particular chapter aren't going to be offensive and may lead to triggers, or they could. Just viewer discretion is advised. Again, Black Cast Art History is committed and dedicated to educating its audiences on a diaspora of melanated people with the intent to provide an honest and holistic history of our narratives. We are committed to ensuring our history and stories are not filtered through white supremacy, indoctrination, dogma, and pseudo-social science. Again, I also want to be transparent. This is going to be another long episode, so beyond the 15 and 20 minutes. Just wanted to give that as well. So again, as I mentioned, we wrap up our Harlem Renaissance chapter with learning about the multitude of Black artists that are impacting not only the Black art scene, but the American art scene, as well as internationally. It's also important to acknowledge that the Harlem Renaissance inspired artistic and creative movements outside of Lenox Avenue in New York City, but also in Chicago and as far as away with Paris with Negritude. And for those who don't know what Negritude is, the Negritude movement is where our Black brothers and sisters were challenging Europe, colonialism, and the antiquated idea of Africa and its people, because this is post the Berlin Conference, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So just to kind of give an idea of what's happening between the 1920s, 1940s, that's the rough estimate of the duration of the Harlem Renaissance. Keep in mind that the Harlem Renaissance is sandwiched between World War I and World War II. So we go from the Roaring 20s to ending up with 1929, the crash of the stock market. I do want to highlight that multiple factors impacted that crash. You had high interest rates, overproduction of agriculture, growing bank loans, overinflating shares, people actually buying less around this time of necessary products, and just more and more contributed to that fall. By 1930s, we're in the Great Depression. It's slower spending, which of course leads to foreclosures of homes and farms. Factories and businesses are shutting down. Mills and mines are closed. Unemployment is high, and it's an endless cycle because as more and more businesses go out, more and more people are unemployed, and it's just that cycle. So in 1933 to 38, Franklin D. Roosevelt issued the New Deal. The New Deal was a series of policies and numerous programs to establish regulations, laws, economic and financial reform, as well as public projects. This was going to help generate the United States from the fall of the stock market, but it's also trying to build American kind of community and camaraderie back together as well. And by 1940s, due to the Great Depression, many people just didn't have the income to purchase, support, or sponsor the arts as much as they did, specifically Black artists. So the glory of the Harlem Renaissance would soon begin to taper off. And just to kind of provide a context too of what's happening in the world of art, because we're going to see this show up in the paintings and the works of these artists. So on your left is Jean-Francois Millet. He's a French artist. This is the Gleaners, 1857. It's oil on canvas. This is realism. And then on your right, you have Pablo Picasso's Three Women's, 1907 and 1908, oil on canvas. I wanted to pick art that was within 50 years and just had similar subject matter, ironically, Three Women, to kind of show what has happened to the trajectory of art going for something that we would consider being able to imitate life to almost to perfection. So now it's just like, let's see what these abstract concepts have. So just to kind of give an idea what's happening, in the mid 1800s, there became a process to create oil paint synthetically. Up until that time, you would have to go to an apothecary and buy the raw ingredients and mix them yourself together. But now there's a synthetic process. So now you can go to the apothecary or now you can go to the store and purchase tubes of paint. One of the most important things that truly impacted it was 1884 to 1885 is the Berlin Conference. So this is when Africa was divided up into European and American colonies. The countries that participated were Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, Turkey, and the United States. This would King Leopold II, if you do not know who he is, look him up. He is a monster. He's worse than Hitler, but that's another story. He would also be kind of facilitating because he was the first to try and go and divvy up the land. The only two countries at that time that had independence were Ethiopia and Liberia. Keep in mind, Liberia was actually kind of like an American colony that they sent newly freed slaves to return to Africa. This was also known for the scramble of Africa. So Europe and the US would bring their military, missionaries, capitalism, economics, ethnocentrism, xenophobia. It's the second great pillaging of the motherland. And because of colonialism exploration, many artworks, items, and objects were stolen from their native space and placed in European museums in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So now many of these European artists would now have access to these African sculptures, African masks, regalia, and so forth. So now they're being inspired by the former quote unquote dark continent. And this is also where art begins to shift. So let's take a look at some of our visual artists of the Harlem Renaissance. So we have Aaron Douglas. I just realized this. Never mind. So we have Aaron Douglas. He was born in Topeka, Kansas, and he would later relocate to Detroit. There, his mom would have him take free art classes at the Detroit Museum. He attended the University of Nebraska. He also tried to sign up for the Student Army Training Corps, but unfortunately, he was denied because, racism. He ended up becoming an art teacher at Lincoln High School in Kansas City, Missouri. Then he decided that he wanted to go to Paris to begin his art career. He said, I'm getting out of here. On his way to Paris, he actually stopped in New York. While in New York, the New Negro movement in Harlem Renaissance was occurring, and that kind of kept him there. And while in New York, he would study under a German artist named Wendell Reese, we're going to learn about later, who encouraged him to work within African themes and also tell his people's stories. He would become an opportunity to be illustrating for Locke, who had the New Negro, Du Bois with the Crisis, and Charles Johnson with Opportunity. So before we move on to the murals, Douglas would receive the Barnes Foundation Fellowship, Harmon Foundation, and much more. These were opportunities and scholarships to allow Black people to create large-scale works of art and even telling the stories of Black folks. He was a professor and the founder of Fisk University Art Department. However, it would be Douglas murals that he would be known for. He is the first African American artist to document African American experiences from slavery to the current times. His murals were inspired by the African motifs and masks that he was able to have access to create these works of art. And this is just the example of aspects of Negro life. Next, we have James LeSesney Wells. He was born in Atlanta, Georgia. His earliest exposure to art was actually helping his mom's kindergarten class with their art projects. Although he attended Lincoln University, he would actually graduate from Columbia University for the BA in art education. When I tell you Wells was like your favorite teacher, he was incredible. In 1929, he taught at Howard. This would include a breadth of media, so block printing, ceramics, clay modeling, and sculpture. In 1931, he convinced Howard to add another media, which was linoleum printmaking, which is something that is highly used today. He would move to New York City. He taught at Utopia Children's House, and this was kind of like a community center where young kids can learn about arts and crafts. He actually establishes the program, and he would teach through various parts of New York City, initiating programs at libraries, community center, public spaces, and so forth. And he would actually retire from teaching at 60 and continue to produce work, and that's a misprint. It's not 90s, it was his 80s. So my apology. He was inspired by biblical imagery. Wells' work often communicated the importance of faith, no matter how dark a situation, which is what we see faith builds in a dungeon. And in The Negro Worker, like many of the artists in the Harlem Renaissance, it was important to capture Black people in the movement, preserving how far we've come from what our ancestors endured. Next, we have Jacob Lawrence, who was born in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Unfortunately, his parents were divorced, and him and his siblings were going to be placed into foster care by their mom. At 13, he would be reunited with his mother in New York. So here's a connection. He also took art classes at Utopia's Children's Center, the Harlem Workshop, and the Harlem Community Art Center. So Lawrence's mom put him and his siblings in everything. He was even a paid artist for the Work Progress Administration and obtained a scholarship to the American Artist School. So the WPA was one of the programs that Roosevelt initiated in his New Deal. He would also be trained by Harlem Renaissance artist Charles Austin and Henry Van Arn. He is the first, and the thing about Lawrence that makes him so important, he is the first African American artist to be educated and trained by African American artists. And although the Great Depression left a gloomy feeling among the U.S., Lawrence advises that their homes were decorated with bright colors and patterns, which will also influence his work. Lawrence is trained in both printmaking and a painter. He would use water-based media to create his works, and many of his works would come in sets of series. So he focuses on telling stories of Black life from racial tension to everyday life in his community. Now, his most well-known series is the Migration series. This series is very important as it helps us to understand not only where Black folk came from in the South from the Great Migration, but what cities they were actually headed to. Next, we have Lois Mailou Jones. She was born in Boston, Massachusetts. They also had a home in Martha Vineyard, and her parents really, really encouraged her. When they noticed her creating work, they started buying watercolors and papers. And because of that push and support, she would also have her first solo show in Martha's Vineyard. She would intern for a costume designer by Grace Ripley, and this is where she started to take interest in the African mask and that influence. She would attend the School of Fine Arts in Boston, focusing on design. However, she would take a painting class at Howard University, switch from design to painting, and end up graduating from Howard magna cum laude. She would take a teaching position shortly after, and over a few summers, she would visit Harlem, where she would experience the Harlem Renaissance and the New Negro movement. Her works are influenced and inspired by the artist Aaron Douglas that we just previously learned about. So in 1937, she received a fellowship to attend the Académie Julian in Paris. She loved Paris as she felt like she was fully accepted. One of the things you will learn, whether it's a painter, sculptor, writer, poet, musician, Paris definitely welcomed Black creatives. She also experienced modernism, such as Cubism and primitivism style. And that's what you see in her works right here. So the one on the left, The Ascent of Ethiopia, that was inspired by Aaron Douglas. Les Fétiches is the one inspired by like the African mask, Cubism, primitivism. She would travel throughout America and Europe and the Caribbean, and she incorporated whatever she learned and observed in all these different places into her art. So Les Fétiches, also impacts the Negritude movement in Paris because Negritude was originally just literary and poetry. She added and sparked the visual arts element to it. Next, we have James Van Der Zee. Van Der Zee was a pianist, aspiring violinist, as well as a photographer. Born in Lenox, Massachusetts, he and his father and brother would actually move to Harlem. He would be part of a quintet band called the Harlem Orchestra. In 1915, he moved to Newark, New Jersey, where he worked at a photography portrait studio, and I think that's where he got hooked. So he would leave New Jersey, come back to Harlem to his family in 1916. He would open a studio on 125th Street in Harlem. The studio would be inside his sister's Jenny Louise Vanderzee, also known as Madame Toussaint, and she owned the Toussaint School of Music and Art. He is best known for capturing the black middle class, and I would even say upper class in Harlem, in addition to the luminaries of the Harlem Renaissance. So one of his most famous and recognizable photographs is The Couple, which is photographed in 1932. You see this beautiful couple, both in full-length furs, this gorgeous car. I mean, clean, sparkling, shine. And it's an indicator of just how well Black folks were doing in Harlem. But his work also just doesn't capture wealth, but it also captures love as well. So this is a portrait of a young couple married, and you kind of see their daughter there as well. So James Vanderzee will also capture pivotal moments of the New Negro movement. This is from Marcus Garvey United Negro Improvement Association Parade, or the UNIA Parade. Again, Marcus Garvey was a Pan-Africanist that said, listen, we ain't trying to be like white folks. We just going to do our own thing. And I'm trying to get some ships to take us back to Africa. That was the Black Star ship line. At the end of the parade, Garvey would speak at Madison Square Garden. Around 25,000 people attended to hear him speak. Next, we have Selma Hortense Burke. She is known as the People's Sculptor. Born in Mooresville, North Carolina, she attended a one-room, of course, segregated school. She would also play with clay on the riverbed after school. While playing with clay, she said, it was there, and I quote, it was there in 1907 that clay discovered me. She briefly attended Winston-Salem University. However, she would graduate from St. Agnes College and become a nurse. She ended up being a nurse to a rich family up there, which afforded her opportunities to take classes in St. Lawrence College. She would go on to marry Claude McKay. Claude McKay is an amazing Jamaican poet, and he's also one of the prolific writers of the Harlem Renaissance. On one side, the upside, Burke was introduced to the amazing creatives of the Harlem Renaissance and had their support. On the other hand, McKay was very cruel to her, even destroying some of her work if it wasn't to his caliber of liking. The other reason that McKay and her didn't work out is because McKay is also a gay Black man who would later he would later come out, or his queerness would be addressed later on as we begin to find like romantic letters between him and some of the other members of the Harlem Renaissance. Burke would work for the Harlem Community Arts Center, and it was a community space for where you can just take classes. At the time, Augusta Savage was head of programming. She was also hired by by Roosevelt's Working Progress Administration for the Federal Arts Program. Burke would travel to Europe thanks to Rosenwald fellowships. She would be able to study in Paris and Vienna. However, she would have to return to the United States due to Hitler's rise in power. She would attend Columbia University and obtain her master's. And Burke is a visionary and legendary. In 1946, she opened the Selma Burke School of Sculpture, and then she would later open the Selma Burke Center of Art in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Burke would create numerous sculptures of Black leaders in various media of wood, limestone, brass, alabaster, and bronze. However, it is her bas relief of Franklin D. Roosevelt that is located in the Recorder of Deeds building in Washington, D.C. Although the unveiling was monumental with President Truman in attendance, there's controversy around it, not from Burke's end, but from the dime designer John R. Sinek. There is many efforts to say he denies that he didn't look at her work. However, many folks believe that he did reference her work to create the dime, and that's the dime just to kind of give you all a reference and comparison. Although he is part of the Harlem Renaissance, Archibald Motley actually lived in Chicago with his maternal grandmother. He would actually travel with his dad when he took railroad trips, so he's able to explore. He's imperative because he highlights what was also happening parallel to the Harlem Renaissance, which was the Chicago Renaissance. He would attend the Chicago Institute of Art. He, at that time, the traditional that I showed you earlier, European styles of art were heavily stressed. The modernism was frowned upon. Even though Motley enjoyed them, he actually kind of kept his modern pieces concealed. He would receive the Harmon Foundation Award in 1928, and he is the first African American to ever have a solo exhibition in New York. And he too worked for the Works Progress Administration. But what's interesting about Motley's work is his struggle with his own identity. He is of Black, white, and indigenous descent. He tried to negotiate his identity through his art. Additionally, he also didn't have like a deep connection or wasn't often around the Black community. And he reconciles his thoughts by portraying racially ambiguous characters in everyday life scenes, being it nightlife or jazz clubs. So if you look at the one on the left, it's a really good example. You can see, like, are they Black? Are they white? Are they colored that way? So much juxtapose the 1935 piece of Saturday Night. Next, we have is Augusta Savage. She worked as an educator, teaching other artists, and worked for equal rights for other Black artists. Savage received opportunities to study overseas, such as Paris and Rome. However, because of her race and lack of funding, she was unable to attend. Her biggest commission was the World Fair to create a piece, and it's inspired by James Weldon Johnson. It was a stunning 16-foot sculpture out of plaster. And that's a copy of it on the left. We do not have the original. We only have replicas of it, like the small mini ones that you could have purchased at the World Fair. But because it was made out of plaster and it wasn't protected in the conditions, we no longer have the original. But the one on the left is actually her nephew, Ellis Ford, and him and his family were staying with her in New York at the time, and he was her model. It's one of her most impactful pieces that we still have. And so what she did was, it looks bronze, but it's paint and plaster. Bronze is expensive, and it also afforded her the opportunity to make multiple copies of it so more people could have access to it. And gamine is just French for kid. So just to go through some of these really quickly, we have Charles Alston. He was the first African American supervisor for Works Progress Administration's Federal Art Project. In addition to being a supervisor, he was a painter, sculptor, illustrator, muralist, and art educator. This is Hale Woodruff, another muralist, painter, artist. One of Hale Woodruff's most impactful work are the 3 mural panels he was commissioned for by Talladega College. It was the Amistad series. We have the first of the panels, which is Mutiny on the Amistad. There were 2 additional ones. We have the trial of the enslaved of the Amistad and their return to their home. So those are still available at Talladega College to see as well. Medavo Wark Fulick. She was the first Black woman and American sculptor known for her sculptures in Paris before the United States. So her acclaim comes from Europe, not the US. We have Romer Bearden, who would bring mixed media with his beautiful 2-dimensional works, adding paper and collage to capture the small jazz clubs and big band orchestra. It would be after the Harlem Renaissance, though, in the 60s, that Bearden would do so many great things, such as being founding the prestigious African American art of the diaspora, the Studio Museum in Harlem. And unlike his colleagues that we've just learned about who've had formal education, Horace Pippin didn't. He was actually considered a folk artist. And that's just what we call artists who didn't have formal training. But what makes Horace Pippin's work so beautiful is because it still captures the honesty and the truthfulness of many of the stories that is based on what he's learned by observing his people and skills that he's acquired on his own. Not only would he tell the narratives of the quiet, calm, everyday life that African Americans did experience, like Christmas morning, but he would also talk about the horrors of humanity, such as war. Whew. Lots of artists, and I still didn't cover all of them. So let's look at Black space and white faces. So these were the safe creative spaces in Harlem. On your left, we have a photograph of the Utopia Children's Center. This was a community space for parents to drop Black children off to learn arts and crafts for free. This is the impact of why spaces like this are still needed today. 3 artists that we've learned about today have connection to it. James Lesanice Wells, the graphic artist, would come up with the arts. He built the arts and crafts program. Charles Austin, one of the painters, he was a teacher there. And Jacob Lawrence, that does the series of artworks, he was actually Austin's pupil. So there we have 3, not even generations, but 3 individuals that would impact and continue to move forward the Harlem Renaissance. And then the Harlem Arts Community Center was ran by Augusta Savage. She is the one we just learned about that did the Lift Every Voice and Sing sculptor and Gamine. And here you can learn a variety of art media: drawing, painting, sculpture. I'm not sure for printmaking as well. And it was either a little cost or no cost at all. Many of the artists of the Harlem Renaissance were pupils, teachers, and sometimes both. And again, this provided an opportunity for Black people to learn about the arts and their history from those in the community. So let's look at specific allies. This is Winold Reese. He is an immigrant from Germany and came to the United States. This man is a talented portrait artist, and he was frustrated with the xenophobia and representation and racism that people of color experience. He sought to challenge the negative visuals of African Americans, Asian Americans, and indigenous people. He would create these breathtaking modernist style portraits that captured some of the big names of the New Negro movement and Harlem Renaissance. He would also be hired by periodicals to create illustrations for them as well. He has a Cincinnati connection because he went to UC. And if you've ever been to Cincinnati Union Terminal, those beautiful mosaics that are in the rotunda when you first walk into the museum, he designed that mural. So I was debating to put Carl Van Vechten in here, and here's why. He was a writer and a photographer from Iowa. He is a quote unquote ally. When he made his way into Harlem, he was enamored with the New Negro movement, the Harlem Renaissance, just Black culture and Black identity. He absolutely was a patron for Black creatives. He refused to attend places like the Cotton Club and boycotted it for being white only. And he would also photograph and capture the artistry and beauty and humanity of these Harlem Renaissance artists. However, he wrote a novel entitled Nigger Harlem in 1926. It was a fiction, and the plot, it was 2 aspiring creatives that were trying to remain in love and grow the romance of their relationship in the face with racism. And he frames their story with the information he has and the circles of the Black intellects, writers, politicians, and creatives, as well as contributing to their stories were incorporated in the novel. Yeah, not everyone was for him. And there's actually a book about the controversy that Van Vechten also had. So let's kind of look at organizations and foundations that would help the Harlem Renaissance. So back to Roosevelt with the New Deal. The Work Progress Administration, specifically the Federal Arts Program, was created to hire artists to not only create public arts of work, but document the United States through artistry post the Depression. Originally, they were not hiring African American artists. However, with protests and making an uproar, talking about the importance of it, more and more African Americans were hired to create works that documented the Black experience. Next, we have the William Harmon Foundation. And the William Harmon Foundation, that is the gentleman below the work PA. And next to him is the catalogs from some of the exhibition. I'm sorry, let me skip that. Yeah, the Women Harvard Foundation is another organization that funded causes such as playground and nurses opportunities. They also had a collection of African American art. It would be in the 1940s, they would expand funding specifically to artists of the African diaspora. This would allow African Americans and Black artists to travel between the US and Africa. And they were the first organization to provide that type of international program to African American artists. In the upper right hand corner, that is Julius Rosenwald. He was a well known businessman and philanthropist. He established the Rosenwald Fund. Although it assisted in aiding multiple causes, multiple fellowships were extended to African Americans that allowed them to travel overseas and study art abroad. Lastly, we have Albert C. Barnes, who was an ally for social justice and discrimination. He was also a part of several Black organizations as well. And even at his business, at the warehouse, employees would actually have time scheduled in their workday to learn about philosophy and art. In 1927, he established funding in the form of scholarship for African American arts, just to either be at what is now the Barnes Museum, which is located right outside of Philadelphia, as well as being a collector of African American art. So, no wrap up. We just gonna do this quote by Langston Hughes. An artist must be free to choose what he does, certainly, but he must also never be afraid to do what he might choose. So that wraps up the Harlem Renaissance. We're finished with chapter 3. Stay tuned for the final chapter of Y'all Late to the Revolution. Chapter 4 is called Waxing Poetics, Melanin Prophetic, and it's the Black Arts Movement. Thanks, guys, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.